April 25, 1915. ANZAC Cove, Gallipoli Peninsula. Private William "Billy" Beach, 1st Battalion, crawls up a scrub-covered ridge. Turkish bullets crack overhead. His Lee Enfield is slung, useless for what comes next. Instead, he drags something else. Something heavy. A circular pan sits atop a long barrel, 47 rounds of .303 British ammunition waiting inside. He sets up behind a rock outcrop. The Lewis gun. 30 seconds later, a Turkish machine gun post opens fire from a trench 200 yards upslope. Beach squeezes the trigger. The Lewis roars, a distinctive rattling snarl unlike anything else on that beach. 5-second burst. The Turkish gun goes silent. Another burst. Stone chips fly from the trench parapet. The Turks pull back. Beach's section advances 20 yards. By sunset, that single Lewis gun had fired over 800 rounds. It never jammed once. The Turkish position that had pinned down an entire company for 3 hours was abandoned. When Australian officers inspected it the next morning, they found 23 spent Turkish cartridge cases, and blood trails leading back into the hills. The weapon that made the difference. Most Australians today have never heard of it. This is the story of the Lewis gun, the machine gun that arrived at Gallipoli as an afterthought and became Australia's most reliable automatic weapon across 2 world wars. When Australian forces landed at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915, they entered a campaign defined by one brutal reality. Machine guns controlled the battlefield. The Turkish defenders, equipped with German-supplied Maxim guns, held elevated positions overlooking the narrow beachheads. Every advance meant crossing open ground under converging fire. The mathematics were simple and horrific: bolt-action rifles versus entrenched automatic weapons. Australian casualties on the first day exceeded 2,000 men. The Australian Imperial Force had landed with exactly 4 Maxim guns per battalion. These weapons, while devastatingly effective, weighed 60 pounds without their tripod mounts. Moving a Maxim during an assault required a 4-man crew and precious minutes to set up. On Gallipoli's broken terrain, steep gullies, scrub-choked ridges, narrow communication trenches, the Maxim became a defensive weapon only. Australian infantrymen attacking Turkish positions had their Lee Enfield rifles and grenades. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Turkish Maxim gunners fired from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. At Quinn's Post, a 30-yard stretch of no man's land, a single Turkish machine gun killed or wounded over 400 Australians in 3 weeks. The British artillery support promised before the landing proved inadequate. Naval gunfire couldn't reach reverse slopes. Australian soldiers needed portable, rapid firepower they could carry forward into an assault. By June 1915, casualty reports reaching Australian Corps headquarters painted a clear picture. Attacks failed not from lack of courage but from firepower disparity. Lieutenant Colonel Pompey Elliott of the 7th Battalion wrote bluntly in his report, "We cannot advance against machine guns with rifles alone. Every section needs automatic weapons. We are asking men to do the impossible." The Australian Light Horse Brigades, fighting as infantry on Gallipoli, suffered particularly devastating losses. At the Battle of the Neck on August 7th, Turkish machine guns killed 123 light horsemen in 4 minutes. The Australians never got within 50 yards of the Turkish trenches. The official historian Charles Bean later wrote, "The courage was there. The means were not." British and New Zealand forces faced identical problems. The British Army had machine gun companies, but these were centrally controlled and rarely available when battalion commanders needed them. New Zealand units shared Australia's equipment shortages. Something had to change, and change fast, or Gallipoli would consume the entire ANZAC force in a war of attrition Australia couldn't win. The Vickers Maxim machine gun, standard across British Empire forces, represented peak 1914 military engineering. Water-cooled, belt-fed, firing up to 500 rounds per minute with remarkable accuracy. In defensive positions, properly supplied with ammunition and water, the Maxim was unmatched. But it was a fortress weapon, not an assault tool. Weight told the story. The Maxim Mark I weighed 40 pounds. Its tripod added another 50 pounds. Ammunition boxes, water for cooling, spare parts. A full Maxim team carried over 200 pounds of equipment. On Gallipoli's vertical terrain, moving a Maxim forward during an attack was impossible. The weapon stayed in fixed positions while infantrymen advanced unsupported. The British Vickers gun, adopted in 1912, improved reliability but not portability. 33 pounds for the gun, 48 pounds for the tripod. Still a two-man weapon at minimum, requiring 4 men for sustained movement under fire. Australian officers repeatedly requested more machine guns. General Birdwood authorized increasing battalion machine gun sections from 4 to 8 Vickers guns. But more guns meant more crews, more ammunition bearers, more logistics, and no improvement in mobile firepower during assaults. French forces used the Hotchkiss M1914, gas-operated and air-cooled. Marginally lighter at 27 pounds, but still tripod-mounted. The Hotchkiss fed from metal strips holding 24 rounds. Reload time was sluggish. Under battlefield conditions, French troops reported frequent feed mechanism failures when strips bent or corroded. Not a solution for Australian needs. The Australians needed something different. Something one man could carry. Something that provided suppressive fire during those critical 30 seconds when soldiers crossed open ground. Something that didn't require a 4-man crew to displace when Turkish counterfire arrived. German forces, ironically, had identified this exact problem. Their answer was the MG08/15, a lightened Maxim with shoulder stock and bipod, weighing 31 pounds. German assault teams used these weapons with devastating effectiveness. At Quinn's Post, captured German advisors confirmed Turkish troops had received training in mobile machine gun tactics. The Germans understood. The British did not. By July 1915, Australian battalion commanders were writing near-identical reports. Major Frederick Toll, 2nd Battalion, require light automatic weapons for section-level use during assaults. Lieutenant Colonel Alec Onslow, 12th Battalion, current machine gun allocations adequate for defense, wholly inadequate for attack. Captain Albert Jacka, VC, 14th Battalion, lost 12 men crossing 20 yards. Single portable machine gun would have suppressed enemy position long enough for section to close. The weapon Australia needed didn't exist in British Army doctrine. But it existed. And it was already trickling into Gallipoli in small numbers, almost by accident. The Lewis gun began not as a military weapon but as an engineer's grudge. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis was born in 1858 in Pennsylvania. West Point graduate, artillery officer, chemist, inventor. By 1910, he designed and patented a gas-operated, magazine-fed automatic rifle that solved the portability problem plaguing military thinkers. Lewis's weapon weighed 26 pounds, roughly the same as a standard rifle with bayonet attached. It used a circular pan magazine holding 47 rounds. Most revolutionary of all, it was air-cooled through an ingenious aluminum radiator shroud that drew heat away from the barrel as the gun fired. Lewis demonstrated his weapon to the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in 1911. He was rejected. General William Crozier, Chief of Ordnance, dismissed the design as too complex for field service. The real reason was simpler. The Army had invested heavily in the Bene Mercy machine rifle, a French design Crozier personally championed. Lewis's superior weapon threatened Crozier's preferred project. Bitter but unbowed, Lewis resigned his commission in 1913. He traveled to Belgium, where the Liège-based Arms Automatiques Company agreed to manufacture his design. The Belgian army ordered modest quantities. Then, in 1913, Lewis traveled to Britain and met with Birmingham Small Arms Company. BSA secured the manufacturing license. The British Army, watching European tensions rise, ordered initial production in 1914. Then the Great War arrived. And suddenly, everyone wanted Lewis guns. The British Royal Flying Corps adopted the Lewis as an observer's gun in reconnaissance aircraft. Lightweight, magazine-fed, reliable, perfect for aerial use. By late 1914, nearly every British aircraft carried at least one Lewis gun. Pilots discovered it worked beautifully at altitude where heavier guns failed. RFC orders absorbed most BSA production. The British Army remained skeptical. Machine gun orthodoxy still centered on the heavy, water-cooled Vickers. The Lewis was considered supplementary at best. But British officers serving in France recognized reality faster than bureaucrats in London. Infantry battalions began requisitioning Lewis guns directly from BSA, bypassing official channels. By early 1915, British Expeditionary Force units in France were unofficially deploying Lewis guns at the company level. Australian forces heard about the Lewis through irregular channels. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Mackay, 4th Battalion, received a letter from a British counterpart in France describing the weapon in glowing terms. Mackay forwarded it to brigade headquarters with a request: acquire Lewis guns for Australian battalions. The request went nowhere initially. Procurement bureaucracy moved slowly, and supplies for Gallipoli were already stretched thin. But in June 1915, a shipment intended for British forces in France was diverted to Gallipoli. 40 Lewis guns, along with ammunition and spare magazines, arrived at ANZAC Cove. Australian battalion commanders immediately requisitioned them. The guns were distributed, 2 per battalion initially, assigned to the most experienced riflemen in each unit. Private Billy Beach, the soldier from our opening, received his Lewis gun on June 18, 1915. He'd been a rabbit hunter in rural Victoria before enlisting, comfortable with firearms, mechanically minded. His section commander, Sergeant Harry Murray, later to win the Victoria Cross, watched Beach disassemble and reassemble the Lewis in under 2 minutes. "Reckon you can use that thing?" Murray asked. Beach grinned. "Better than shooting rabbits, Sarge." 3 days later, the 1st Battalion assaulted German officers' trench. Beach's Lewis gun provided covering fire that allowed his section to reach the Turkish parapet. The attack succeeded. Word spread through Australian lines. The Lewis gun worked. Technical breakdown. The Lewis gun measured 50.5 inches overall length, weighing exactly 26 pounds unloaded, 28 pounds with a full 47-round magazine attached. Chambered in .303 British, the standard rifle cartridge used throughout British Empire forces, the Lewis ensured ammunition compatibility across all infantry weapons. This seemingly simple design choice proved tactically invaluable. Any soldier could resupply a Lewis gunner with standard rifle ammunition. The operating mechanism was pure mechanical elegance. Gas-operated, air-cooled, firing from an open bolt. When the trigger was pressed, a spring-loaded firing pin struck the cartridge primer. Expanding gases from the fired round traveled forward through a gas port beneath the barrel, pushing a piston rearward. This piston was connected to a rotating bolt. As the piston moved back, it rotated the bolt to unlock it from the barrel extension, then drew the bolt rearward to extract and eject the spent case. The return spring then drove the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. As the bolt traveled forward, the piston mechanism rotated it back into battery, locking it closed. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second. Rate of fire, approximately 500 to 600 rounds per minute, though short controlled bursts were standard practice to prevent barrel overheating. The cooling system was where Lewis's engineering genius truly shone. Instead of water cooling like the Vickers, Lewis designed an aluminum radiator shroud surrounding the barrel. As hot gases escaped from the barrel's muzzle, they created a suction effect, drawing cool air in through the rear of the shroud, passing it along the barrel, and exhausting it forward. This passive cooling system required no water, no extra weight, and worked continuously as long as the gun fired. Barrel changes were possible but rarely necessary in typical combat engagements. The pan magazine, distinctive, circular, mounted horizontally atop the receiver, was both the Lewis gun's most recognizable feature and its most criticized component. The magazine held 47 rounds in a double-stacked spiral pattern. Spring tension forced rounds inward toward the center, where the bolt stripped them for feeding. Loading a pan took approximately 2 minutes by hand. Experienced gunners carried 4 to 6 loaded magazines in canvas pouches. Critics argued the pan magazine was vulnerable to damage and prone to jamming if dented. In practice, Australian soldiers found the design robust. Unlike side-mounted magazines on other weapons, the top-mounted pan allowed the Lewis gunner to fire from a prone position without the magazine digging into the ground. Gravity also assisted feeding reliability. Rounds naturally fed downward into the action. The bipod attached near the muzzle, folding backward when not in use. Simple, sturdy, adjustable. The rear stock was wooden, checkered for grip, with a metal butt plate. Sights consisted of a post front sight and an aperture rear sight adjustable for range. Effective range was listed officially as 800 yards, though practical effective range in combat conditions was closer to 600 yards for aimed suppressive fire. BSA manufactured Lewis guns in Birmingham using traditional machining techniques. The barrel was made from high-carbon steel, rifled with a 1 in 10-inch twist rate. The receiver was machined from solid steel bar stock. Aluminum castings formed the radiator shroud. Wooden furniture came from British walnut or, when supplies ran short, beech or birch. Each gun underwent proof testing, firing 50 rounds at maximum pressure before being approved for military service. Weight distribution made the Lewis surprisingly easy to carry. The center of gravity sat just ahead of the pistol grip, allowing a soldier to carry the weapon cradled in one arm during movement. 4 sustained fire positions. The bipod provided stable support. Some Australian troops removed the radiator shroud when fighting in jungle environments during later campaigns. The passive cooling was less necessary in rapid-fire engagements, and removing the shroud saved 2 pounds of weight. Variants developed throughout the war. The aircraft Lewis removed the radiator shroud entirely, unnecessary at altitude and reduced weight for aircraft installation. Magazine capacity increased to 97 rounds for aircraft versions, using larger diameter pans. Post-war, the Mark II Lewis incorporated minor refinements, improved pan release mechanism, modified sights, reinforced barrel collar. But the fundamental design remained Isaac Newton Lewis's original 1911 patent. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We're building something here for people who actually care about the details, the engineering, the history, the forgotten stories that shaped modern warfare. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Right, back to Gallipoli. The Lewis gun's first significant combat test in Australian service came during the August Offensive of 1915. On August 6, the 4th Brigade attacked Hill 971, the highest point on the Surrey Bear Range. Lieutenant Walter Cass commanded a platoon equipped with 2 Lewis guns. His objective: assault a Turkish position nicknamed the chessboard, due to its distinctive trench pattern visible from Australian lines. Cass placed his Lewis gunners, Privates George Howell and James "Jimmy" Reed, in forward positions with orders to provide suppressive fire while riflemen advanced by sections. At 0530 hours, the attack commenced. Howell's Lewis gun opened fire first, raking the Turkish parapet from a range of approximately 300 yards. Turkish defenders returned fire immediately, but the volume of Lewis fire forced them to keep their heads down. Reed's gun joined in, firing from a different angle, creating crossfire that prevented the Turks from concentrating their defense. Cass's riflemen advanced 70 yards in the first rush. Turkish machine gun fire from a flanking position wounded 3 Australians, but Howell redirected his Lewis gun onto the Turkish Maxim. 5-second burst. Pause. Another burst. The Turkish machine gun went silent. Later assessment revealed Howell had struck the Maxim's water jacket, disabling the weapon. The Australian section reached the Turkish trench. Corporal Albert Hewitt, 4th Battalion, recorded in his diary, "The Lewis gun is worth 10 riflemen in an attack. Turks can't return fire when a Lewis is working them over." Jimmy Reed fired 2 full pans in under 4 minutes. Not one stoppage. Gun just kept rattling. At Quinn's Post in September 1915, Lance Corporal William Dunstan used a Lewis gun to repel a Turkish counterattack. Dunstan, a 23-year-old clerk from Adelaide, had received his Lewis gun training only 3 weeks earlier. When Turkish troops emerged from a communication trench at dawn, attempting to rush the Australian parapet, Dunstan engaged from 15 yards. He fired 3 magazines, 141 rounds, in approximately 90 seconds. The Turkish attack collapsed. Dunstan counted 19 Turkish casualties in front of his position. His Lewis gun, examined afterward, showed no mechanical failures despite rapid sustained fire and accumulation of dust and debris. Sergeant Harry Murray, the same Murray who'd supervised Billy Beach, used Lewis guns in coordination during the assault on Hill 60 in August. Murray positioned 3 Lewis guns in a triangular formation, each covering different approach routes to the Australian objective. When Turkish reinforcements attempted to counterattack at 1700 hours, all 3 Lewis guns engaged simultaneously. Murray later reported, "The Turks never got within bombing range. The Lewis guns broke up their formation before they could organize a rush. We held a position through the night because those 3 guns controlled all the approaches." Turkish documents captured at Hill 60 included an intelligence assessment of Australian weapons. A Turkish officer wrote, "The Australians possess a light machine gun, belt-fed or magazine-fed. The circular pan confused Turkish observers, which provides fire volume equal to Maxim but is carried by individual soldiers. This weapon is highly effective during assaults and has caused significant casualties among our defensive positions. Recommend increased use of indirect fire to suppress these weapons before Australian attacks." Reliability statistics from Gallipoli tell a compelling story. Official British reports from November 1915 compared Lewis gun stoppage rates against Vickers machine guns. The Vickers, in defensive positions with regular maintenance and resupply, achieved approximately 1 stoppage per 2,000 rounds fired, excellent performance. The Lewis gun, used in forward assault positions, exposed to dirt, dust, and rough handling, achieved approximately 1 stoppage per 1,500 rounds fired. Given that the Lewis operated in far harsher conditions, this reliability was extraordinary. Australian soldiers nicknamed the Lewis the Belgian Rattler, a reference to its Liège manufacturing origins and its distinctive firing sound. Other nicknames emerged: the Pancake Gun, for its circular magazine, the Panhandler, Louis. The affection was genuine. Private Archie Barwick, 1st Battalion, wrote home in October 1915, "Give me a Lewis gun over a dozen rifles any day. It saved my life at Lone Pine." Turkish bombers were coming over the parapet when our Lewis gunner, fellow named Mitchell, opened up point blank. Gun didn't flinch. Just kept firing. We held that traverse because of that gun. The Lewis gun proved adaptable to unexpected roles. At ANZAC Cove, Australians mounted Lewis guns on improvised anti-aircraft mounts to engage German aircraft spotting for Turkish artillery. The high-angle fire required removing the bipod and supporting the weapon on sandbag rests, but Lewis guns successfully drove off several reconnaissance aircraft. Captain Percy Black, 2nd Battalion, noted, "Our Lewis gun fired on a German Taube at approximately 800 feet altitude. Didn't bring it down, but the pilot turned away." Artillery spotting ceased for the remainder of that day. By December 1915, when Australian forces evacuated Gallipoli, Lewis gun allocation had increased to 6 guns per battalion, a 50% increase over the initial deployment. Every battalion commander requested more. The weapon had proven itself in the most demanding environment imaginable: trench warfare on mountainous terrain against a determined enemy equipped with modern weapons. Lieutenant Colonel John Monash, commanding the 4th Brigade, wrote in his after-action report, "The Lewis gun is the single most valuable infantry weapon introduced during the Gallipoli campaign. Its portability, reliability, and firepower provide section and platoon commanders with tactical flexibility impossible with crew-served weapons. Recommend maximum possible allocation to all Australian infantry battalions for future operations." The forgotten machine gun had made its mark. The Lewis gun fundamentally altered Australian infantry tactics in ways that extended far beyond Gallipoli. When the AIF redeployed to the Western Front in 1916, Australian commanders brought with them hard-won lessons about mobile firepower. British doctrine still centered on centralized machine gun companies. Vickers guns concentrated at battalion level, allocated by senior commanders. Australian doctrine evolved differently. By mid-1916, Australian battalions fielded 12 Lewis guns, double the British allocation. More significantly, Australians pushed Lewis guns down to the platoon level. Where British platoons relied on rifle fire with occasional Lewis gun support, Australian platoons built their tactics around the Lewis gun as the primary assault weapon. Rifles supported the Lewis gun, not the other way around. At Pozieres in July 1916, this tactical evolution proved decisive. The 1st Division attacked German positions that had resisted British assaults for weeks. Australian platoons advanced with Lewis guns in the lead, providing suppressive fire while rifle sections maneuvered. The weight of automatic fire allowed Australians to cross no man's land faster, with fewer casualties, than traditional rifle and bayonet assaults. Captain Clarence Smith, 45th Battalion, developed what he called fire and movement sections. Each section of 10 men included 1 Lewis gunner, 1 assistant gunner, and 8 riflemen divided into 2 4-man fire teams. The Lewis gun would engage the target while 1 fire team moved forward. When that team reached cover, they'd provide rifle fire while the Lewis gun displaced forward. Leapfrog tactics, enabled entirely by portable automatic firepower. German intelligence reports from 1917 specifically identified Australian Lewis gun tactics as problematic. A captured German document from April 1917 noted, Australian assault formations differ from British. Australians advance with automatic weapons forward, achieving fire superiority at close range. Recommend prioritizing suppression of Australian automatic weapons during defensive operations. The psychological impact was significant. German soldiers interviewed after the war consistently mentioned Australian firepower. One former German NCO recalled, "You could tell when you were facing Australians. More machine gun fire during attacks. They didn't come in waves like the British, they came in small groups, each with an automatic weapon. Much harder to stop." Adoption rates across the Australian Imperial Force tell the story quantitatively. In early 1916, the AIF fielded approximately 240 Lewis guns across all divisions. By November 1918, that number had grown to over 3,300 Lewis guns. Every Australian infantry battalion on the Western Front carried 36 Lewis guns by war's end, triple the initial allocation and significantly higher than British battalions, which typically fielded 24 Lewis guns. This proliferation of automatic weapons gave Australian forces a force multiplier effect. An Australian battalion with 36 Lewis guns could generate more sustained fire than a comparable British battalion with fewer guns. During the 100 Days Offensive in 1918, Australian divisions consistently achieved breakthrough objectives faster than neighbouring British or Canadian units. While multiple factors contributed to this success, the sheer volume of Lewis gunfire provided Australian infantry with suppression capability that allowed rapid exploitation. The Lewis gun also enabled new tactical formations. The diamond formation, developed by Australian units, placed Lewis guns at the cardinal points with riflemen filling the gaps. This formation provided 360-degree automatic fire coverage, critical when advancing rapidly through broken German defensive lines where threats could emerge from unexpected directions. At the Battle of Hamel in July 1918, Australian sections using diamond formations successfully cleared German strongpoints that had held up Allied advances for days. Long-term, the Lewis gun influenced Australian military doctrine through the interwar period and into World War II. The concept of section-level automatic weapons, 1 automatic weapon per 8 to 10 riflemen, became standard Australian practice. When the Bren gun replaced the Lewis in the late 1930s, it inherited the same tactical role the Lewis had pioneered. Australian infantry sections in World War II, equipped with 1 Bren gun per section, were directly executing tactical concepts proven with the Lewis gun at Gallipoli and the Western Front. Production and service life. Birmingham Small Arms Company manufactured approximately 145,000 Lewis guns between 1914 and 1918, making it one of the most produced light machine guns of the Great War. BSA's Birmingham factory employed over 5,000 workers at peak wartime production, operating 3 shifts around the clock. Women comprised nearly 40% of the Lewis gun production workforce, a significant departure from pre-war British manufacturing norms. Production cost per Lewis gun in 1916 was approximately £165 sterling, roughly £11,000 in modern currency. This was expensive compared to a Lee Enfield rifle at £3, but remarkably economical compared to a Vickers machine gun at £250. The cost-effectiveness made the Lewis attractive to procurement officers managing wartime budgets. Manufacturing challenges centered on the Pan magazine. The spring mechanism required precise tension, too weak and feeding failures occurred, too strong and soldiers struggled to load the magazine. BSA developed specialized machinery to wind and set magazine springs to exact specifications. Even so, approximately 10% of manufactured magazines failed quality control testing and were scrapped. Savage Arms Company in the United States manufactured an additional 60,000 Lewis guns under license, primarily for US and Belgian forces. The American-manufactured Lewis guns differed slightly, metric threading on some components, minor tolerance variations, but were functionally identical to BSA production. Australian forces received Lewis guns through standard British Army supply channels. The weapons arrived at Australian supply depots in Egypt, then were distributed forward to units in the field. By 1917, dedicated Lewis gun training schools operated in Egypt and England, training Australian soldiers in weapon maintenance, tactical employment, and basic armour skills. The schools graduated approximately 8,000 Australian Lewis gun specialists during the war. Post-war, the Lewis gun remained in Australian service far longer than in British forces. The British Army phased out the Lewis in favour of the Bren gun beginning in 1938. Australia, with smaller defence budgets and fewer resources for rearmament, continued using Lewis guns through the early years of World War II. Australian garrison units in Australia and Papua New Guinea carried Lewis guns as late as 1942. During World War II, Lewis guns saw renewed combat service in Australian hands in the Mediterranean and Pacific theatres. The 2 7th Battalion used Lewis guns during the Siege of Tobruk in 1941, some weapons having served continuously since 1916. Australian commandos in New Guinea occasionally carried Lewis guns during jungle patrols in 1942, valuing the weapon's reliability despite its obsolescence. The Lewis gun officially left Australian service in 1943, replaced entirely by the Bren gun and American-supplied Browning automatic rifles. Surviving Lewis guns were placed in storage or converted to training weapons. Many were eventually scrapped post-war during the 1950s demilitarization programs. Today, approximately 50 Lewis guns are held in Australian collections. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra displays 6 Lewis guns, including one carried at Gallipoli by the 1st Battalion and another used by Australian forces at Posières. The Army Museum of Western Australia holds 3 Lewis guns, one accompanied by documentation tracing its service history through both World Wars, a rare provenance. Collector market value for functional Lewis guns ranges from $35,000 to $60,000 Australian dollars, with documented Australian service examples commanding premium prices. Deactivated Lewis guns, legal for private ownership in Australia with appropriate licensing, trade for $8,000 to $15,000 Australian dollars depending on condition and provenance. Several Australian private collections include working Lewis guns, maintained in firing condition using ammunition hand-loaded to original specifications. Annual historical firearm events in Queensland and Victoria occasionally feature Lewis gun demonstrations, keeping the weapon's memory alive among military history enthusiasts. The Lewis gun's influence on subsequent Australian weapon development was profound. When the Australian Army issued requirements for the Owen submachine gun in 1941, designers explicitly referenced the Lewis gun's reliability under harsh conditions as a benchmark. The Owen's top-mounted magazine, unconventional and initially criticized, drew directly from Lewis gun experience. Gravity-assisted feeding improved reliability, and the magazine position allowed prone firing without interference. Internationally, the Lewis gun influenced an entire generation of light machine gun design. The Soviet Degtyaryov DP-27, adopted in 1928, used a pan magazine mounted atop the receiver, a direct conceptual descendant of the Lewis. The French Châtellerault M1924/29 light machine gun incorporated gas operation principles pioneered by Isaac Newton Lewis. Even the American Bar, while using a different operating system, filled the same tactical niche the Lewis had defined: portable automatic fire at the squad level. British military historian John Keegan wrote in 1998, "The Lewis gun represented a conceptual breakthrough more significant than its mechanical innovation. It demonstrated that firepower could be decentralized, that automatic weapons belonged in the hands of frontline soldiers, not concentrated in specialized units." This insight reshaped infantry doctrine throughout the 20th century. Australian military doctrine embraced this lesson earlier and more thoroughly than most armies. The 1930s Australian Infantry Training Manual explicitly prescribed section tactics built around the light machine gun, a direct evolution from World War I Lewis gun employment. This doctrinal foundation served Australia well in World War II, where Australian infantry sections with Bren guns consistently demonstrated superior tactical flexibility compared to forces lacking section-level automatic weapons. Modern Australian infantry sections, equipped with F-89 Minimi light machine guns, 2 per section, execute tactics that would be recognizable to a 1917 Lewis gunner. Fire and movement, suppression and maneuver. The principle remains identical. Only the technology has evolved. In 2015, the Australian government commemorated the centenary of Gallipoli with a series of historical publications. The official history volume on Australian weapons development devoted an entire chapter to the Lewis gun, acknowledging its role as the weapon that modernized Australian infantry tactics and proved that Australian soldiers could innovate under pressure. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis died in 1931, never having received recognition from the U.S. Army that rejected his design. But British, Belgian, and Australian forces awarded him medals and honours. Australia made him an honorary member of the Returned Soldiers Association in 1927. When Lewis visited Melbourne that year, over 500 Australian veterans attended a ceremony in his honour. Many brought their wartime Lewis guns. One veteran reportedly told Lewis, "This weapon brought me home alive. Never jammed. Never quit. Just kept working." Lewis, by then 73 years old, wept. 26 pounds of steel and aluminum. 47 rounds in a circular pan. A gas piston that never failed in the mud of Gallipoli or the trenches of France. This was the weapon that gave Australian infantry firepower when they had none. This was the weapon that cleared Turkish trenches at Quinn's Post and broke German lines at Pozieres. This was the weapon that Australian soldiers trusted more than any other. So reliable that men carried it through 2 world wars, across 3 continents, refusing to surrender it even when newer weapons arrived. The British had the Vickers, too heavy. The Germans had the MG-08, too complex. The Americans had the Chauchat, too unreliable. The Turks had the Maxim, too static. Australia had the Lewis. And in the scrub-covered ridges above Anzac Cove, in the cratered hell of the Somme, in the desperate retreats of 1918 and the final offensives that broke the Hindenburg Line, that made all the difference. The forgotten machine gun. Remembered by those who carried it.